Hi everyone, this is a refresher on chapter 1 of The Great Gatsby. The beginning of chapter 1 is the voice of Nick Carraway. We meet our narrator immediately as soon as the story opens. And an important decision that you have to make as readers is whether or not you accept Nick's version of events. He's recounting this 2 years after it happened. Remember that for your form, it's a recount. And he's the only person whose view we ever get. So you need to make an assessment of how much his involvement in these matters has affected what's happened, whether another view might be possible, whether or not he's a reliable witness. He's generally accepted to be an unreliable narrator, but the extent to which that's the case is something that you're going to need to decide for yourselves. He opens by establishing his credentials. He tells us that when he was younger, his father gave him a piece of advice which set him apart from other people. The advice was just to remember that other people are not as lucky as you are. It's not exactly earth-shattering. But he says that as a result of this, he's been inclined to reserve judgment. Nick is establishing his position on the moral high ground, and he stays there for the whole book. He's the guy who says that he realises that the fundamental decencies are parcelled out unequally at birth. And he repeats that at the end of the book. It's a way of indicating that he's one of the people who's got the fundamental decencies, and you can't say that for everybody. He gives us a bit of background and how he'd has reached the end of the experiences that happened 2 years before, ready to never go back to the privileged glimpses into the riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. So he characterises the events of the book, which he is writing, and he tells us that, as being a riotous excursions, and it's something that he has developed a distaste for. He doesn't like it, he doesn't want to go there. He exempts Gatsby from this judgment, and Gatsby, he is described as somebody who is... It's a difficult thing to analyse. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him. I think it's the gorgeousness that we need to remember. Some heightened sensitivity to the promise of life. Something about Gatsby's romantic readiness speaks to Nick, and it's an extraordinary gift for hope. Now, we can say that this is characterising the American dream. The American dream itself is an extraordinary gift for hope. Nick says that Gatsby turned out all right in the end, so there is an end at which it would be possible not to turn all right. We know that he was found dead, full of bullets at the bottom of his swimming pool. It doesn't sound great. But Nick says it's what preyed on Gatsby. That foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. Nick is speaking to us as a disillusioned person who has this golden promise, this individual who is so special and spectacular and sensitive and ready for the romance of life, that he holds him up as an example of something good. Then we get a bit more of Nick's backstory, and what he's doing here is telling us that he's from stolid Midwestern stock. They made their money in a wholesale hardware business. They've got a lot of dough. He's gone to Yale. He's studied there. But when he comes home from the Great War, from World War I, and we've discussed in class how much this led to the disillusionment of a whole generation of people, particularly writers, who begin to question everything. The America that they're living in is so different from the ideal. So he decides to go east and learn the bond business. The important thing to note here is we are establishing the West as a place which is conventional, dull, thrifty, hardworking, agrarian, much more like the American past, the time at which the Founding Fathers actually fought for independence from Britain. But now what we've got happening east is this furious, riotous living where people are making a fortune, and going into the bond business is basically saying, I want to be in the money market, I want to make heaps, I want to work hard, it's boom times, and I want my bit of it. So he's trying to get some excitement into his life. He has a cousin who lives near the house that he rents, which is in a place called West Egg, and he has a neighbour who turns out to be Gatsby, who lives in a house which is described as being a colossal affair by any standard. So the grandiosity of Gatsby is established by his house. His house is not an authentic house. It's not a true historical mansion, not a piece of ancient America. Not that there can be ancient America. It's a copy of a French chateau, a Hotel de Ville in Normandy. It's got a tower on it, so we're evoking fairy tales and the charmed life of the person who lives in here, and that's followed through in the rest of the book. He describes it as a white palace of fashionable East Egg. Sorry, opposite it, the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glitter along the water. Now, we know that Tom and Daisy Buchanan live in one of those white palaces. So already we've set up a kind of fairyland by the sea in West Egg and East Egg. He's remotely related to Daisy, and her husband Tom is somebody that he knew at college. Tom is characterised immediately as having various physical accomplishments. He was a terrific football player, and he's peaked when he was 21. So that just about everything that happened since savours of anticlimax. Tom is potentially a disappointed man. It's hard to know how they really came to be living where they are. They drifted here and drifted there. Importantly, Tom is described as being too rich for the comfort of the other undergraduates, and as an example of this, he's brought a string of polo ponies down to live here at East Egg. So he's an extremely grandiose man with enormous money who's never had to think about anything. It's all just been there for him. So they've drifted here and there, and at the moment they've landed in East Egg. He goes over to meet them, and when he arrives at the house, we get this glorious metaphor of the lawn, running across a quarter of a mile, jumping over sundials and brick walls and burning gardens, and finally drifting up the side of the house in bright vines as though from the momentum of its run. This wonderful, vigorous image of the lawn being alive and racing, and that sadly is not a vigour and a love of life that is shared by the people inside it, but it's pretty surprising. When we meet Tom, Fitzgerald gives us one of the few detailed physical descriptions that we get in the book anywhere. On the whole, you need to watch for the fact that things are disembodied. We are not given detailed descriptions. There's no description of Gatsby himself physically, his clothes, but not the man. We don't have a description of Nick. We don't know what he looks like in the mirror. And we get a sense of Daisy, her voice, the lightness of her dress. We know about the attributes of the people. The technical term for this is synecdoche, where some part of the person stands for the whole thing. But disembodiment is another word which you can use for that, and it's a standard technique in modernist literature, and it evokes the idea of detachment and lack of soul, lack of depth, not being truly there somehow or another. But when we meet Tom, he's changed. He's a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30 with a rather hard mouth and a supercilious manner. He's not a nice man. Tom is never a nice man. Two shining, arrogant eyes established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance always of leaning aggressively forward. So the word cluster that we have when we meet Tom is arrogance, aggressive, dominant, supercilious, rather hard. Okay? The power of the body. He uses this phrase, effeminate swank. So he's dressed up, so he looks a bit effeminate, which is not a term we'd use disparagingly anymore, but at that time it could have been. The enormous power of the body is hidden. He seemed to fill the glistening boots till he strained the top lacing, and you could see a great pack of muscle shifting when his shoulder moved under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. We know that Tom has a big, powerful, muscly, cruel body, and that he's not a nice guy. And all of these things are going to come true as we go on. We go inside and we meet Daisy, but before we meet Daisy, we get another of these wonderful descriptions where, with pure poetry, we have a description of the room at which two young women are sitting at the end on a sofa, which is buoyed up like a hot air balloon. It's like a fairy tale. And the wind, the breeze, rustles through the room and it lifts and twists the curtains and they fly up to the ceiling where there's a wedding cake. It's like a wedding cake ceiling, a chandelier, and it's absolutely, it's all too pretty to believe. It's so glorious and out of this world. The two girls include Daisy and a stranger who turns out to be Jordan Baker. When Daisy hops up to say hello to her second cousin Nick, once removed, what she actually says is, I'm paralysed with happiness. I think it's pretty easy to see that she's an indolent woman. Her clothing is described as lighter than air. Her and Jordan's dresses